There is something about Keanu Reeves that words alone cannot fully capture. In an industry built on image, ego, and power, he walks through it all like a man who never forgot where he came from. He has lost people he loved deeply. He has carried grief that would break most of us. And yet, he still holds the door open for strangers. He still sits alone on a park bench without a bodyguard in sight. He still treats every single person he meets like they truly matter. That is why he inspires me. Not because he is a movie star, but because he is living proof that fame does not have to steal your soul. Sandra Bullock once said that Keanu is completely different from everyone else in Hollywood. Not a little different. Completely different. And when you hear the story I am about to share with you, you will understand exactly what she meant. So stay with me until the very end, because this story will change the way you see not just Keanu Reeves, but the meaning of real kindness. The evening air carried a strange kind of stillness, the kind that settles over a place just before something shifts forever. The last trace of sunlight was fading behind the Malibu hills, turning the sky into quiet shades of amber and pale violet, and somewhere in the distance the ocean breathed slowly against the shore. Inside the grand estate, hundreds of crystal glasses waited on white linen tables, catching the early glow of chandeliers that had not yet been turned to full brightness. There was a feeling in that room that was hard to name, a quiet heaviness that pressed against the chest without any clear reason. It was the kind of moment where you pause and wonder if the night ahead will be ordinary or if it will leave a mark that never fades. Sandra Bullock stood near the entrance, her invitation held loosely in one hand. She had attended this event before. It was called the Golden Circle, Hollywood's most exclusive annual charity gala. Every year, the biggest names in the industry gathered here not just to raise money, but to play a game that nobody talked about openly. A game of power, influence, and loyalty. At the center of it sat a man named Vincent Crowe, one of the most powerful studio heads in the business. Crowe had built his empire not on talent alone, but on control. He decided who rose and who disappeared. If you were loyal to him, doors opened. If you were not, those same doors closed quietly, and no one ever asked why. Sandra had seen it happen too many times. Young actors full of passion walking into this world with bright eyes, only to be slowly hollowed out by the machinery behind the curtain. She had learned to keep her distance from Crowe, to smile politely and never get too close. But this year, something pulled her back. It was a name on the guest list she never expected to see. Keanu Reeves. He never came to events like this. He avoided the spotlight, the politics, the noise. So when Sandra saw his name, a quiet chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. She called him that same evening. There was no assistant answering, no manager screening the call. Just Keanu picking up after one ring, his voice calm and familiar. "Hey, Sandy," he said, as if they had spoken just yesterday. She asked him directly, "Keanu, why are you going to the Golden Circle?" There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you someone is choosing their words with care. Then he said quietly, "Someone asked me for help. I could not say no." He did not offer anything more, and she knew him well enough not to push. Whatever was pulling him toward that gala, it was personal and it was serious. Sandra made a decision right then. She would go not for the party or the cameras, but to stand beside him if the night turned dark. The evening of the gala arrived with the kind of perfection that only money could buy. The estate glowed with golden light. Waiters moved silently between guests carrying trays of champagne. Laughter floated through the air, bright and sharp, but if you listened carefully, you could hear the edge beneath it. This was not the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of performance. Everyone here was acting, even off camera. Sandra moved through the crowd, nodding and smiling, doing what she had learned to do at events like these. But her eyes kept searching for one person. She found him outside, not at the VIP section, not at the champagne bar. Keanu was sitting on a stone bench in the garden beneath a string of soft white lights, talking quietly to a young woman in a catering uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back, her hands trembling slightly around a glass of water. Her eyes were red. She had been crying. Sandra stopped a few steps away, close enough to hear but far enough not to intrude. The young woman's name was Maya Torres. She was 22 years old, a struggling actress who had come to Hollywood 3 years ago with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. She had talent and she had passion, but she also had something this industry often punished. She had integrity. Maya had been noticed early by one of Vincent Crowe's people. She was offered a place in what they called the Loyalty Circle, an unspoken arrangement where young actors traded personal favors for career access. Maya refused. She said no with a steady voice and a trembling heart, and from that moment her world went silent. Auditions stopped. Her agent dropped her without explanation. Casting directors who once smiled at her now looked through her as if she did not exist. She was erased. But Maya did something most people in her position would never think to do. She sat down at her small kitchen table one night and wrote a letter by hand to Keanu Reeves. She sent it to an old fan mail address she found online with no expectation of a reply. She simply told him her story honestly and quietly with the kind of courage that has no audience. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. It was Keanu. He had read every word. He did not call to offer her a role or money. He called to ask her one simple question. What do you want, Maya? Not what they want. What do you want? And in that moment, for the first time in over a year, Maya felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt seen, truly and completely seen. Now here they sat in the garden, two people the industry had no use for in that moment, while inside the gala hummed with power and pretense. Keanu listened to Maya the way most people have forgotten how to listen, with his whole attention and his whole heart. Sandra watched from the shadows and felt something tighten in her chest, because she knew this world well enough to understand one thing clearly. What Keanu was doing tonight was not just kind. It was dangerous, and Vincent Crowe was already watching. Sandra did not sleep well that night after the garden conversation. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the sounds of the ocean outside her window did nothing to calm the storm inside her mind. There was a weight pressing against her thoughts, a feeling she could not shake no matter how many times she turned over and closed her eyes. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to knowing that something was coming and not being able to stop it. She kept seeing Maya's face, the way the girl's hands trembled around that glass of water, the way her voice cracked when she talked about being erased. And she kept seeing Keanu, sitting there so still and so steady, as if the chaos of the world had no hold on him. But Sandra knew better. Kindness like that always comes with a cost, and she was terrified of what that cost might be. The next morning, she made a few phone calls. She reached out to people she trusted, people who had been in the industry long enough to know where the real power lived and how it moved in the dark. What she learned made her stomach turn. Vincent Crowe had not just noticed Keanu's presence at the gala. He had already started planning. One of Sandra's contacts, a woman who worked in Crowe's production office, told her in a shaking voice that Crowe had spent the past 48 hours preparing something for the main ceremony. A video montage. It was supposed to look like a tribute, a celebration of Hollywood's finest moments, but buried inside it was something else entirely. Crowe's team had pulled old interviews of Keanu from over the years and edited them together in a way that twisted every word. Moments where Keanu spoke about simplicity were cut to sound like arrogance. Moments where he talked about walking away from big deals were reframed as disloyalty. The whole thing was designed to do one thing: make Keanu Reeves look like a man who thought he was better than everyone else in the room. Sandra felt sick. She knew how this worked. She had seen careers destroyed not by truth but by narrative. In Hollywood, it did not matter what you actually said. It mattered what people believed you said, and Crowe was a master of belief. He had shaped the stories of dozens of careers, lifting some and crushing others with nothing more than a well-placed whisper and a carefully edited clip. Now he was turning that weapon on Keanu, and the worst part was that Keanu had no idea. She drove to the estate that afternoon, hours before the evening ceremony was set to begin. The place was already buzzing with preparation. Florists arranging towering centerpieces, sound engineers testing microphones, lighting crews adjusting every shadow to perfection. Sandra moved through the chaos with purpose, looking for the AV room where the video equipment was being stored. She found it on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. The door was closed. Two men in dark suits stood outside, arms folded, faces blank. Crowe's private security. Sandra tried to walk past them casually, but one of them stepped forward and blocked her path. "Private area," he said flatly. "No guests allowed." She smiled and made an excuse about looking for the restroom, then turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She tried a different approach. She found one of the event coordinators, a young man named Daniel who she had worked with at previous galas. She pulled him aside and asked if there was any way to access the AV system or change the video lineup. Daniel looked at her with wide eyes and shook his head. "Everything tonight runs through Mr. Crowe's team directly," he whispered. "I do not even have the passwords. Whatever is on that screen tonight, it is locked in." Sandra thanked him and walked away, feeling the walls closing in around her. She thought about calling the press, about leaking what she knew to a journalist who could blow the story open before the ceremony started. But Crowe had thought of that too. The gala operated under a strict media embargo. No press was allowed inside. No phones were permitted in the main hall. Every guest was required to check their devices at the door. Crowe had built a sealed room where he controlled the story completely, and there was no crack in the wall large enough for the truth to slip through. With no other option left, Sandra found Keanu. He was in a quiet room on the ground floor, sitting by a window, watching the gardeners trim the hedges outside. He looked peaceful in a way that almost made her angry. She sat down across from him and told him everything. The video, the editing, the plan to humiliate him in front of 400 of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, expecting shock or anger or at least the tightening of his jaw. But Keanu just listened. He listened the same way he had listened to Maya, fully, quietly, without interruption. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Keanu said something that Sandra would never forget for as long as she lived. Let him play it. Sandra stared at him. She felt her breath catch in her throat, and for a second she thought she had misheard him. She leaned forward and said, Keanu, he is going to destroy your reputation in front of everyone who matters in this industry. You cannot just let that happen. Keanu looked at her and his eyes were calm, not empty, not cold, but calm in the way that deep water is calm. My reputation is not who I am, Sandy, he said softly. If I fight him with his own weapons, I become him. I did not come here to win. I came here so Maya could speak. Sandra sat back in her chair and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not admiration exactly. It was something deeper and harder to name. It was the feeling of standing next to someone who had already made peace with losing everything, and because of that could never truly be defeated. Keanu had lost so much in his life. He had buried people he loved. He had walked through grief that would have broken most people beyond repair. And somewhere in that long, painful journey, he had let go of the one thing that kept most people in Hollywood trapped: the need to be seen as powerful. He had nothing to protect, no image, no brand, no throne. And that made him the most dangerous person in the room, not because he could fight, but because he could not be controlled. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in deep shades of red and orange, and inside the estate the guests were beginning to arrive. Sandra watched through the window as limousines lined the driveway and famous faces stepped out into the golden light. Somewhere in that stream of silk and tailored suits, Vincent Crowe was preparing to take the stage. And somewhere in the kitchen, Maya Torres was tying her apron with shaking hands, unaware that in just a few hours her life and the lives of everyone in that room were about to change in ways none of them could predict. The main hall was full now, and the noise inside it had a strange quality, like the hum of electricity running through a wire pulled too tight. 400 guests sat in curved rows of velvet chairs, facing a stage draped in black and gold. The chandeliers above had been dimmed to a warm amber glow, casting long, soft shadows across the faces of people who spent their lives pretending to be someone else. Sandra took her seat in the front row and folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. She glanced to her left and saw Keanu sitting 3 seats away, still and quiet, his eyes fixed on the stage. He looked like a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose tonight. Vincent Crowe stepped onto the stage at exactly 8 o'clock. He moved with the kind of confidence that came not from courage but from control. His suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair swept back, his smile wide and practiced. He stood behind the podium and looked out at the room as if he owned every person in it. And in many ways, he did. He began his speech slowly, his voice rich and measured, talking about legacy and loyalty and the sacred bond between the people who built this industry. He spoke about sacrifice and dedication, about the ones who understood that being part of Hollywood was not just a career but a calling. Every word was carefully chosen. Every pause was designed to land with weight. And then he said something that made Sandra's blood run cold. Tonight, he said, I want to show you something. A reminder of who we are and what we stand for, and perhaps a reminder that not everyone understands what it means to truly be part of this family. The screen behind him flickered to life. The montage began. At first, it looked like a celebration, clips of classic movies, behind-the-scenes moments, actors laughing together on set. But then the tone shifted. Keanu's face appeared on screen. The first clip showed him in an old interview, talking about how he preferred to live simply. But the edit cut his words short, making it sound like he was looking down on people who enjoyed success. Another clip showed him discussing why he had turned down a major franchise deal. In context, he had been talking about creative integrity. But the way it was cut, it sounded like he was calling the project and everyone involved in it beneath him. Clip after clip, each one twisted just enough to feel believable, painted a picture of a man who thought he was above the industry that made him. Sandra watched the room carefully. She could see the effect it was having. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged glances. A few nodded slowly as if the video was confirming something they had always secretly suspected. That was Crow's genius. He did not create lies from nothing. He took small truths and bent them until they looked like something ugly. Sandra turned to look at Keanu. His expression had not changed. He sat with the same quiet stillness, watching the screen without flinching, as if the images flickering above him belonged to someone else's story. When the montage ended, Crow smiled at the audience and said smoothly, "Not everyone understands what it takes to be part of this family." The room was silent. The air felt thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sandra felt her pulse hammering in her temples. She looked at Keanu and saw him stand. Every pair of eyes in the room turned to follow him. Crow's smile widened slightly, as if he had been expecting this, as if he had already prepared his next move for whatever Keanu might say. But Keanu did not walk to the stage. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look at Crow. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the room, toward the kitchen entrance where the catering staff stood in a quiet line, invisible to everyone who mattered. He stopped in front of Maya Torres. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, her hands gripping a serving tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Keanu gently took the tray from her hands and set it down on a nearby table. Then he offered her his hand. "Maya," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear, "you do not have to be afraid. I am right here." She took his hand. He led her slowly through the rows of velvet chairs, past the staring faces, past the whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. He brought her to the center of the room, directly in front of the stage where Crow still stood with his fading smile. Then Keanu turned to the audience and spoke. His voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was steady and clear and impossibly calm. "I am not here to defend myself," he said. "I do not need to. But this woman, Maya Torres, she has something to say. And I think if this industry is what it claims to be, you will listen." He stepped aside. Maya stood alone in the center of 400 powerful strangers, a 22-year-old girl in a catering uniform with nothing but her truth. Her voice shook when she began to speak. She told them about coming to Hollywood with a suitcase and a dream. She told them about the auditions, the hope, the small victories that kept her going. And then she told them about the night she was offered a place in the loyalty circle, about the man who sat in a dark office and explained to her what she would need to give in exchange for a career. She told them how she said no, and she told them what happened after. The silence, the closed doors, the feeling of being erased from existence while the world kept spinning around her. The room was completely still. Nobody moved, nobody whispered. Maya's voice grew steadier as she spoke, as if each word she released took a small piece of the weight off her shoulders. But Sandra was not watching Maya. She was watching Crow, and what she saw made every muscle in her body tense. Crow had lifted his left hand slightly and made a small gesture toward the back of the room. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Sandra caught it. She turned her head just enough to see two of Crow's security men beginning to move through the crowd, stepping carefully between the rows of chairs, heading straight for Maya. At the same time, she noticed a third man near the side wall reaching for the main lighting panel. They were going to cut the power. They were going to plunge the room into darkness and remove Maya before she could say another word. Sandra's heart slammed against her ribs. She had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the center of the room. She looked at Keanu. He had seen them too, but he did not move. He stood beside Maya with his hands at his sides and his eyes fixed forward, as if he had already accepted whatever was about to happen. Sandra realized in that moment that he was not going to stop them, not because he did not care, but because he believed that fighting force with force would destroy the very thing they were trying to protect. It was up to her now, and she had seconds to decide. Sandra felt the decision arrive inside her chest before her mind could even form the thought. It was not a calculated move. It was not strategy. It was something older and simpler than that, something that lived beneath all the years of navigating this industry, beneath all the careful smiles and measured words and quiet compromises. It was the part of her that still remembered why she fell in love with storytelling in the first place. Because stories are supposed to give voice to the voiceless. Because art is supposed to be the place where truth finds a home. She stood up from her seat in the front row, and the sound of her chair shifting against the polished floor cut through the silence like a heartbeat. She walked to Maya's side and put her arm around the girl's trembling shoulders. Then she turned to face the room, her eyes sweeping across 400 faces, some shocked, some confused, some frozen in the kind of discomfort that comes from watching something real happen in a place built entirely on illusion. Sandra did not yell. She did not make a dramatic declaration. She simply spoke in a voice that was steady and warm and impossibly clear. "If anyone touches this girl or silences her voice, you will have to go through me first. And I promise you, I am not as nice as Keanu. A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but it faded quickly. The weight of what was happening was too heavy for laughter to carry. The security men stopped. They stood in the aisle between the rows of chairs, uncertain, looking toward the back of the room where Crow stood on the stage with his jaw tight and his hands gripping the edges of the podium. For the first time all evening, his composure had cracked. Not shattered, not broken, but cracked just enough for the people closest to the stage to see something behind the polished surface. Fear, not fear of Sandra or Keanu or Maya, fear of losing control. Because control was the only thing Vincent Crow had ever truly owned, and in that moment it was slipping through his fingers like water. Then something happened that Sandra had not planned for, something that no one in that room could have predicted. A woman in the third row stood up. She was a veteran actress, someone who had been in the industry for over 30 years, someone whose name had once lit up marquees around the world before she quietly faded from the spotlight. She did not say a word. She simply rose to her feet and stood there, her chin lifted, her eyes glistening. A moment later, a young director 2 rows behind her stood up as well. Then a cinematographer near the window. Then an older actor near the back who had not spoken publicly in years, a man who had once been one of the brightest stars in Hollywood before his career was ended by a whisper campaign he could never trace back to its source. He stood with tears running down his face, and his hands were shaking, but he stood. One by one, like candles being lit in a dark room, people rose from their seats. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to fill the silence with something that felt like courage, enough to make the security men step back without being told, enough to make Crow's hands fall from the podium and hang at his sides. Sandra looked at Keanu and saw something she had rarely seen on his face. It was not pride, it was not triumph, it was gratitude, deep, quiet, overwhelming gratitude. As if he had spent his whole life believing in something that he was finally seeing with his own eyes. The belief that if you simply make space for the truth and trust the goodness in people, they will rise. Maya looked around the room at all the faces turned toward her, and for a moment she could not speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide and filled with the kind of disbelief that comes from being invisible for so long that you forget you have a shape. You forget you take up space. You forget that your voice can reach the ears of another human being and actually matter. Keanu placed his hand gently on her shoulder, just for a second, just enough to remind her that she was not dreaming. She took a breath, and then she finished her story. She did not ask for revenge. She did not point fingers. She did not demand that anyone be punished or shamed or destroyed. She simply said what she had carried inside her for so long, the words she had whispered to herself on all those nights when she sat alone in her tiny apartment wondering if she would ever be seen again. I do not want anyone to be punished, she said, her voice cracking but never breaking. I just want to be seen. I just want the next young girl who walks into this industry to know that she does not have to sell her soul to tell a story. That is all I want. That is all I have ever wanted. The room did not erupt in applause. There were no standing ovations, no dramatic music, no sweeping cinematic moment. Instead, something far rarer happened. Silence. A long, deep, living silence that pressed against every chest in that room and asked a question that no one could answer out loud. When did we stop protecting people like her? When did we start looking away? The silence held for what felt like an eternity, and in that silence something changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, the way the ground shifts miles beneath the surface before anyone on top feels the tremor. Vincent Crow left the stage without another word. He walked down the side steps, crossed the room with his eyes fixed on the floor, and disappeared through a side door. No one stopped him. No one confronted him. No one needed to. His power had never been built on strength. It had been built on the belief that no one would ever stand up. And now that belief was broken. In the weeks that followed, the quiet tremor became a wave. People who had been afraid to speak began to speak. Conversations that had been whispered in dark corners moved into open rooms. An investigation was launched, not because of a dramatic exposé or a viral moment, but because enough people simply stopped being afraid. Crow's empire did not collapse in a single day. It eroded slowly, steadily, the way all things built on silence and fear eventually do when the silence is finally broken. Maya Torres received a phone call 3 weeks after the gala. It was from an independent filmmaker named Grace Chen who had somehow obtained a recording of Maya's speech from that night. Grace was working on a small film about a young woman rebuilding her life after losing everything, and she wanted Maya to audition. Maya drove to the audition in a borrowed car with a script she had read 14 times. She got the part. It was a small role. It would not make her famous, but it was hers. Earned with nothing but talent and truth, and the kind of courage that has no audience. Sandra gave an interview 1 month later. The journalist asked her the question that everyone in the industry was quietly asking. Why do you think Keanu Reeves is different from everyone else in Hollywood? Sandra paused for a long time before answering. She looked down at her hands and then looked up with a softness in her eyes that the journalist had never seen from her before. Because everyone in that room was trying to be the most powerful person there, she said. Keanu was trying to be the most useful. He does not collect power, he gives it away. He walked into a room full of lions and he did not try to be the biggest lion. He just opened the cage for someone who had been trapped. That is not celebrity. That is character. And honestly, Hollywood does not have an award for that, which is exactly why it matters. Months passed. A quiet Tuesday morning arrived, the kind of morning where the world feels unhurried and gentle. Maya walked into a small coffee shop in New York for a meeting about her second film role. The place was warm and smelled of fresh coffee and old books. She ordered her drink and turned to find a table, and then she stopped. Sitting in the corner alone, reading a paperback novel with a cup of black coffee beside him, was Keanu Reeves. No entourage, no bodyguards, no sunglasses. Just a man reading a book in a coffee shop like anyone else in the world. Maya walked over to him. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes before it ever reaches the mouth. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I do not even know how to repay you." Keanu looked at her for a moment, and his eyes held something that was both sad and beautiful at the same time, the look of a man who had learned through great loss that the most valuable things in life can never be bought or sold or traded. "You just did," he said quietly. "You did not give up." Then he went back to his book. Maya sat down at her own table, opened her script, and began to read. Two ordinary people in a coffee shop on a quiet Tuesday morning. No red carpet, no cameras, no applause, just kindness sitting quietly across the room from courage. And maybe that is the whole point. Maybe that is what Sandra was trying to tell us all along, that the measure of a person is not found in how brightly they shine when the world is watching. It is found in how they treat people when nobody is watching at all. Keanu Reeves did not fight Hollywood's ego that night. He did not tear anyone down or burn anything to the ground. He simply reminded a room full of people who had forgotten that there was something better than power. There was compassion. There was decency. There was the simple, radical, world-changing act of seeing another human being and saying, "You matter." This story carries a few lessons that I think are worth holding onto. The first is that true strength is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It is about having the courage to be quiet and let someone else be heard. Keanu did not take the stage that night. He gave it away. And in doing so, he showed more power than anyone who has ever stood behind a podium demanding attention. The second lesson is that kindness is not weakness. In a world that often rewards aggression and self-interest, it is easy to believe that being kind means being soft. But Keanu's kindness was not soft. It was deliberate. It was brave. It cost him something, and that is what real kindness always does. It asks you to risk something of yourself for the sake of someone else. The third lesson is that one person standing up can give an entire room the courage to rise. Sandra stood. Then one woman in the third row stood. Then another. Then another. Courage is contagious. But someone always has to go first, and going first is the hardest thing any human being can do. And the final lesson is perhaps the most important one of all. You do not have to be famous to matter. Maya was a 22-year-old girl in a catering uniform. She had no platform, no followers, no power, but she had her truth. And when she was given the space to speak it, that truth moved an entire room. Your voice matters. Your story matters, even when the world tries to convince you that it does not. So the next time you feel invisible, the next time you feel like your kindness goes unnoticed or your integrity goes unrewarded, remember this. Somewhere out there, someone like Keanu Reeves is reading your letter. And somewhere inside you, there is a courage that no one can erase. All you have to do is stand up.